All right, you can see those and I'll get underway. Thank you very much for having me along today, and it's great to join what looks like a really interesting program. I hope the discussions have been going very well. Yeah, so I'm an economist at the Australian National University here at the Crawford School in Canberra. So hi everyone from Canberra, probably several others I guess from Canberra on the call, but yes, hi from the capital. What I'm going to do today is just introduce some of our results. We had a study looking at the question of, okay, carbon pricing makes a lot of theoretical sense. Economists and others have been arguing for it for quite a long time. But how about if we look at the data and we try to put together a large data set of as many countries as possible, and we try to estimate the effect of carbon pricing on emissions. That was our study, and it, like normal research, it took a while, and then it was under peer review, and then it came out. This paper came out in winter this year in July. So I'll introduce some of the results, but in a way that does not involve many large statistical tables. But I'm happy to share the paper with anyone at all. So please do feel free just to drop me an email if you'd like the paper, and I'll send it straight over. That'd be fine. Just to get things going, I know the group here already thinks a lot about these issues, but I think a good way just to get going is to ask a bit of a question, and maybe I'll ask it kind of rhetorically. But the question is, what happens if you put a tax or a levy on windows, right? Imagine that the government were to introduce a tax on window space or the number of windows. It sounds a bit ridiculous, but actually in history this has been used. So in England, this was introduced in 1696 and kept in place for quite a while as well. So yeah, just think to yourself, or please feel free to add to the chat, what do you think would happen if a window tax was introduced? A key thing that would happen is us humans, we love getting away from paying some tax, especially if we can easily rearrange our affairs to reduce our tax burdens. And that is a key thing that we did see, or people who were alive back in those days did see, when it came to window tax. So new places were built with smaller windows or no windows. Existing windows were boarded or bricked up like this. What do you call a window once it's been bricked up? I'm not sure if there's a special word for it, but I'd call it a wall. It's no longer a window anymore, and they didn't have to pay the tax. Public policy should not be designed to reduce window space. There's no, that I'm aware of, there's not a strong public policy argument for doing this, and it's just weird to have a response like this to a key tax. So don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not recommending a window tax. However, the idea with carbon pricing is to use this logic about how people can rearrange their affairs and substitute away from something, and then to apply it to emissions. So emissions are a bad, windows are not a bad, but emissions are a bad. So if we put a tax or a levy, some type of price on emissions, carbon emissions and also local emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions, emissions into waterways and so on. If we put a price on those things, then the private market sector based economy will naturally deliver less of them, fewer of them. If you want another example, how about a levy on the width of houses? In the Netherlands, they did have such a levy back in history, and when you do have a levy like that, then you're naturally going to be getting narrower houses. The houses might still be quite big, they might be deep, they might be tall, but you're going to get narrow. Carbon pricing has been taking off slowly over this century. The first carbon price was introduced in 1990 in Finland, and some slow adoption in Europe prior to the adoption here of the European Union emissions trading scheme in 2005. That was a key year. Still, most emissions are not priced, most emissions globally. However, this is a graph that was in The Economist earlier this year. Coverage has been heading upwards, and a big step will come when China's national emissions trading scheme is fully launched within coming months. Other countries have also been introducing carbon prices in recent years. So for example, Singapore and South Africa both introduced carbon taxes in 2019. So there has been adoption, although, yeah, most emissions and most countries are still not subject to carbon pricing. The recent study that I'm introducing with some results today was with one colleague, Rowan Best from Macquarie University in Sydney, and another colleague from ANU, Frank Yotzo. And what we did was we put together a data set of 142 countries from 1990 until the most recent year that we could cover. And the data set includes quite a few things. So it includes the CO2 emissions from energy use of each country. It includes a whole lot of variables that we use as control variables in our analysis. And what we're interested in is, if we control for many other factors, can we notice an effect of carbon pricing on the emissions growth rates and or emissions levels of countries? Does carbon pricing lead to a noticeable effect, and what is it? We, of course, expected from theory that carbon pricing should be putting downward pressure on emissions. But when you're doing a big research activity like this, we don't know what we're going to get when we set out for it. And actually, we didn't care. We're just trying to test whether we could see anything in the data and then report the results. So the question was, how effective has carbon pricing been in reducing CO2 emissions? And our analysis covers the energy sector. Why the energy sector? Well, the data are quite good for the energy sector. They cover lots of countries. They're available annually from the International Energy Agency and other sources as well. And the energy sector, of course, is the key one. It accounts in total for about 80% of global CO2 emissions each year. The energy sector includes electricity, it includes industrial energy use, transport, so it's very broad. And there have been some previous studies looking at individual schemes. So for example, looking at Sweden's carbon tax, or looking at the British Columbia carbon pricing scheme, carbon tax again, and looking at their effects on emissions. But ours is the first one covering a really large group of countries. We used regression analysis, so statistical techniques to compare countries with carbon prices against those without. So it's a little like medical research. We have a treatment group and a treatment. The treatment here is carbon pricing. We have a control group, that's the countries and also the years in which there's no carbon price in place. And what we do is we try to, it's not a randomized controlled trial, we're just using observed data, but what we do is we try to control for other differences. Countries differ in other ways. They have other policy differences. For example, energy efficiency policies or feed-in tariffs for renewables, or like Australia's RET scheme, the Renewable Energy Target, which more generally is called an RPS, a Renewable Portfolio Standard. We control for those types of other policies which are in place. We control for other key differences between countries. So for example, the former USSR countries, their emissions trajectories are quite different over the years compared to others. We control for that, and we control for level of development and other factors as well. Which countries have a price on carbon? So currently, 46 countries have a scheme of some type. That's a scheme that applies at the national level or a subnational level. So for example, Singapore has a carbon tax, that's a national one. China has had pilot schemes for carbon pricing that's been at the subnational level with the national ETS on the way. 46 countries currently have some type of carbon price, and this includes European Union countries that are part of the EU emissions trading scheme. So that's actually an international or regional scheme, and that applies to each country that is a participant. Other countries, Japan has a carbon tax plus a couple of emissions trading schemes at the subnational level. Carbon tax is national. Korea has a national emissions trading scheme. Singapore, Kazakhstan has an emissions trading scheme, and so on. New Zealand, for example, has an emissions trading scheme as well. The United States, as another example, some states are participants in carbon pricing arrangements, emissions trading schemes. And here I'm thinking California and then also the northeastern states as well. In our analysis, we distinguish between national schemes and subnational, and in our main analysis, we just use variables that represent the average carbon price applicable in each country for emissions from the energy sector. Empirical results. So our findings boil down to a few key results. Having a carbon price versus not having one. We find that on average, if you have a carbon price in place, controlling for as many other things as we can, then a country's observed CO2 emissions growth rate, it's about 2 percentage points lower on average. Let me just explain that. So for example, instead of growing by 1% per year, 1 minus 2, that country would be having emissions decline of 1% per year, right? An emissions growth rate of minus 1% per year. Or for example, instead of having emissions growth of 3% per year, once you have a carbon price in place, we'd expect that to fall from 3% per year down to 1% per year. So it's really, the way to think about it is it's against a business as usual, or the scenario in which you did not have the carbon price. And the underlying pressure for emissions growth is a function of various things: a country's level of development, their population growth rate, and other things. Just focusing on the effect of a carbon price, we find it's about 2 percentage points. Having a higher carbon price leads to quicker emissions reductions. An additional, we're not using US dollars in this analysis, we're actually using euro. And we find an additional euro per ton CO2 of carbon price. On average, that leads to a reduction in the annual growth rate of CO2 emissions of about 0.3 percentage points. So what that means is, and we should just be applying this result just to relatively small changes in carbon price rather than a huge big one. But if, for example, you go from a carbon price of 5 euros per ton CO2 to 6 euros, then we'd expect that to be dragging down your emissions growth rate by about 0.3 percentage points. Okay, so from about, you might otherwise have been expecting emissions growth of 1% per annum. An additional euro per ton CO2 would drag that down to 0.7% per annum. Difference there being 0.3 percentage points. We also tested in the paper, could we see any difference in the effect of a euro per ton CO2 carbon price, right, on emissions growth, depending on whether a carbon price was via a carbon tax or via an emissions trading scheme. We tried to test if we could see any difference in the effects of these two types of approaches. And statistically, we didn't find anything interesting. We found that both types of schemes tend to place downward pressure on emissions growth. But when testing the difference between the two types of schemes, we didn't find anything noteworthy or of interest there from a statistical point of view. That's not particularly surprising because we would expect the key thing is the level of the carbon price. If the average carbon price applying across the emissions is 10 euros, then whether it's a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme is a secondary question when it comes to the effect on emissions. There are many reasons why one might argue in favor of a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. There are many different points and differences between the two approaches. Here we were only testing, could we see a differential effect on emissions? And we couldn't find anything interesting to report there. So I just want to do a few case studies and introduce some graphs so that we're looking at the key stories. The European Union Emissions Trading Scheme has to date been the most important carbon pricing scheme. Launched in 2005, it actually operates in 31 countries, 27 EU countries, plus it's still in the UK, even though they've left the EU now. As of today, they're still in the EU ETS. Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein as well. A good thing about the EU Emissions Trading Scheme is that it's calibrated to keep tightening. It's just a very nice feature of the scheme. Every year, the emissions cap winds back or is reduced by 1.74% per annum. So it's just a system which reins in emissions in a gradual, steady way over time. Interestingly, next year, that rate will increase to 2.2% per annum. They are moving to a more ambitious series of reductions in the size of that cap. The current permit price is 24 euros per tonne CO2. It's quite high. Just having a look at emissions from fuel combustion in the EU, one thing for sure is emissions have been declining since the introduction of the EU ETS in 2005. Quite a nice and steady reduction, really, in CO2 emissions from energy use in the EU. In Australia, of course, we most famously had a carbon price in place for 2 years. Under the Gillard government, we had a price that was introduced. It was initially 23 Australian dollars per tonne CO2 and went up slightly in the second year. I have just obtained the data from Australia's government on Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, but I've excluded agriculture, land use change and forestry because the carbon price was not applying to those things. One thing that we saw under Australia's scheme is that emissions dropped quite quickly during those 2 years. Emissions have also rebounded after the removal of the carbon price. And that's exactly what we would expect. It was predicted. We thought that would happen. A carbon price would be put in place, emissions would fall. As soon as the carbon price was removed, then that gives an incentive to go back to using more brown coal, black coal, and so on. So we did see a rebound pretty much straight away as soon as the carbon pricing scheme was removed. Our emissions have been increasing. This goes until the end of 2018, 2019. So probably this year it's going to come down like this, but yeah, the graph goes until the end of the 2019 Australian financial year. In our region, there has been some action. Singapore has introduced a carbon tax, 5 Singaporean dollars per tonne CO2. That's between $3 and $4 US per tonne CO2. Here it is, 3.7 US dollars per tonne CO2. Their scheme covers about 80% of their greenhouse gas emissions. They're going to review that tax rate in 2023. It's still too early, really, to evaluate the effect of this scheme, but it's a bit interesting that in the last couple of years, the year before the scheme started and the year of the scheme's introduction, we have seen a reduction in emissions in Singapore. It's too early though. We need to give it a bit more time to see how this one takes effect. A little bit on our region. I often do work focused on China and Indonesia and elsewhere in the region. The last 5 to 6 weeks have been spectacular in terms of progress on net zero emissions targets. And this would have been very difficult to predict 12 months ago. Most were not predicting this. China announced that by 2060, they would be targeting net zero emissions. China is by far the world's largest emitter. That's an amazing and potentially economy transforming announcement. And within the last couple of weeks, actually within the last 1 week, Japan and South Korea have both announced their net zero by 2050 targets. And those announcements also are very substantial. China's national emissions trading scheme is on the way. Really, they're still testing it, and that there are some issues still that they're working through, but expect it to be launched within the coming months. It will cover 1,700 emitters in the power sector. China emits a lot in the power sector. This is a very large and substantial ETS. One other development is that Vietnam is currently considering its own emissions trading scheme. Let's wait to see if they make an announcement on that one over coming months. Just briefly on Australia's emissions reduction policy, we got rid of our carbon price. Emissions have been going up from key sectors. Although it's important to note that in the electricity sector, emissions have been declining recently, as we've been moving to more and more solar and wind, which is a great news story in Australia. However, those declines have been previously overtaken or overcompensated by increases in emissions from other parts of the economy, including the liquefied natural gas sector, which itself uses natural gas in the liquefaction process and so on. In Australia, instead of the carbon price, we have an emissions reduction fund. This is a subsidy scheme to pay voluntary projects to reduce emissions. I'll say a couple of things about that. I understand you have a session on the safeguard mechanism coming up, so I won't mention much about this. And also recently, a key thing that the government has been interested in is their technology investment roadmap. Really, the key pillar currently in our emissions policy is the emissions reduction fund. This is a subsidy fund to pay for individual projects, for example, projects that promise to not cut trees, or projects that promise to reduce emissions by putting in energy efficient lighting and things like that. This scheme was introduced under the Abbott government in 2014 to replace the carbon price. One of the big downsides, and happy to follow up on email or anything about this, one of the big downsides of this scheme is that some of those voluntary projects, not all of them, but some of them most likely would have gone ahead anyway without this government funding coming into it. For some of the voluntary projects, this government scheme is very attractive because it's possible to be paid a bit of a premium or top up for their project that they were planning to implement. And remember, in a dynamic economy like Australia's, every year the private sector does introduce some of its own projects to try to save on energy use and subsequently emissions as well. For this and many other reasons, the Emissions Reduction Fund is not an effective and comprehensive economy-wide approach to be pushing to very low emissions. Over the last little while, just recent weeks, the government has introduced its technology investment roadmap, the first statement. They're going to make a statement every year. This statement does some good things. It prioritizes some promising things like clean hydrogen, energy storage. Energy storage will have to be a key part of our future electricity system and energy system. Also prioritizing low carbon steel and aluminium, carbon capture and storage, and soil carbon. The problem is it's very nice to have priorities and to have wish lists, right? But where's the deployment mechanism? How will this actually happen? Australia currently is lacking a strong deployment mechanism for technology, low carbon technology. That exactly is what carbon pricing is. It's just a signal that's sent out there, a financial signal that's sent out there to encourage the economy to switch towards lower emissions methods. So we're lacking a technology deployment mechanism. There are other ones other than carbon pricing, like the renewable energy target. It could be extended, but carbon pricing still in Australia would be a very useful reform. And it's not just incentivizing emissions reductions in electricity, but other sectors as well. I know that you have been very much championing this model, the carbon fee and dividend. So I just thought I'd say a couple of things on this. There are multiple designs for carbon pricing. A carbon fee and dividend is one of the good ones. I mean, I think it's a good design, and most economists are pretty keen on this type of design. One of the benefits is it's simpler than an emissions trading scheme. It doesn't involve all of the trading of permits between enterprises throughout a year. A key benefit of this approach is it ensures that revenues benefit the public, and also a very key part of that is that it does that in a very visible way via the dividend coming in. A carbon tax, that revenue can be used in ways that benefit the public also, but it's a bit more hidden within the government budget. It might be able to be spent on new schools, new hospitals, and so on, but that exact mechanism is more hidden. The beauty of this carbon fee and dividend model really is that the benefit back to the public is very visible, and that therefore can build in and contribute to public support. All right, I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions, and thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our CCL channel by hitting the button in the top left-hand corner of this screen. Spread the word of CCL by using the share icon to as many of your contacts as possible. Thank you. See you next video.